think that this is one of those questions that before you can get to the specifics, it really has to be understood in the context, the broader context of the interfaith movement and interfaith dialogue. There's a book put out by an organization called the IIIT. I just want to show you that, and we'll get to it later. But the IIIT is the International Institute of Islamic Thought, and of course the name of that book is The Interfaith Dialogue, A Guide to Muslims. And going back to it, the IIIT is an organization that is known to be one of the original Muslim Brotherhood organizations in America. So that we kind of know that the Muslim Brotherhood has a specific interfaith outreach strategy that they titled the book The Interfaith Movement. And so I think that as we look at the question of what happened in the Vatican, we need to look at it in that context. I'd like to read something from Reliance of the Traveler. It's the classic manual of Islamic law. And I'd like to read this because there's going to be a couple questions that come from this. In Book O, Justice, Book O is the Book of Justice, Section 9, the section on jihad, it says, jihad means to wage war against non-Muslims and is etymologically derived from the word mahajada, signifying warfare to establish the religion. And it is the lesser jihad. Well, that's the definition of jihad in Islamic law. So the question I have to ask is, am I making a generalization when I say that? Am I hateful for reading it? Because some would call these statements generalizations, even as tens of thousands of innocent people are being killed by those who hold those views. So I'd like to read off a quote to you, if I could. The quote is, faced with disconcerting episodes of violent fundamentalism, our respect for true followers of Islam should lead us to avoid hateful generalizations. For authentic Islam and the proper reading of the Quran are opposed to every form of violence. Do you know who said this? It was Pope Francis in Evangelii Gaudium, a Vatican publication that came out last November in paragraph 253. So I'm reading Islamic law that says jihad means to wage warfare, and I'm reading this, and it seems to be saying that if I say this, even though I'm reading it, I'm making a generalization which is hateful. Let me go back to that definition of jihad, because immediately following that definition, it flat out says, the scriptural basis for jihad prior to scholarly consensus is such Quranic verses as, fighting is prescribed from you, verse 2:216, slay them wherever you find them, Quran verse 489, and fight the idolaters utterly, Quran verse 936. And it goes on and says, and such hadiths as the one related by both Bukhari and Muslim that the Prophet said, quote, I have been commanded to fight people until they testify there is no God but Allah, and that Muhammad is the messenger of Allah, and perform the prayer and pay the zakat. It goes on. And then he says, and the hadith reported by Muslim, to go forth in the morning or evening to fight in the path of Allah is better than the whole world and everything in it. So here I'm being told that authentic Islam and the proper reading of it are opposed to every form of violence, and I've just read a book right out of Islamic law that says exactly the opposite. So I'm reading Islamic law saying that those verses of the Quran call for jihad, which is defined as warfare to establish the religion. So there's no mystery in this. So what is the objective of jihad? Well, let's continue down in this book on Islamic law. The objective of jihad at 09.8, the Caliph makes war upon Jews and Christians and Zoroastrians, provided he has first invited them to enter Islamic faith and practice. And if they do not, then invite them to enter the social order of Islam by paying the non-Muslim poll tax, the jizya. And it goes on. And we'll come back to this reading later. But I think what needs to be understood here is that when we go back and you could say, well, Steve, anybody could write a book of Islamic law. Who put this book of Islamic law out? Well, at the beginning of that book, they have certifications of who certified it. And I'd just like to point out two of them. One was Al-Azhar. Al-Azhar is considered the most preeminent school of Islamic thought. They can issue fatwas on their own, in their own authority, and sometimes do. They're one of the groups that approved this book, and it says, We certify the above-mentioned translation corresponds to the Arabic original and conforms to the practice and faith of the Orthodox Sunni community, the Al-Sunnah al-Jamaah. There is no objection to printing it or circulating it. But who else authorized this book? Well, the other certification comes from a man named Taha Jabbar al-Alwani, and he signed it on the International Institute of Islamic Thought letterhead. That's the IIIT. The IIIT was founded in 1980 in Northern Virginia and is understood to be one of the early Muslim Brotherhood organizations in America. But let's take a look at this signature block, because he didn't just sign it as president of the IIIT, he also signed it as president of the Fiqh Council of North America. The Fiqh Council of North America is a subordinate element of the Islamic Society of North America. They are the Muslim Brotherhood in North America. And one other thing, he signed it as member of the Islamic Fiqh Academy in Jeddah. Well, it's my understanding that the Islamic Fiqh Academy in Jeddah is a subordinate element of the Organization of Islamic Cooperation, the OIC. And the OIC is the second largest intergovernmental organization, second only to the United Nations. It represents all 57 Islamic states, 56 and the Palestinian territory. And so if they certified this book of Islamic law, it means that I'm reading a text of Islamic law that says jihad means to wage war against non-Muslims, and it went on and said the authority from that comes from the verses of the Quran I just quoted and the Hadith, the sayings of the Prophet that verified that. So it's not a generalization for me to say that. It's not hateful for me to point it out, and it does seem to indicate that at least some proper readings of the Quran are not opposed to every form of violence. So I just think that that's very important. So why am I referring to this book in the context of the question you asked about what happened on the Vatican lawn earlier this month? And it's this. If we throw in the U.S. Conference of Catholic Bishops, the USCCB, the certifying authorities I just mentioned represent the entities with whom the Vatican and the USCCB undertake interfaith dialogue. So that has a way, and we'll get back to it again, of bringing in interfaith dialogue as understood by the IIIT. To be clear, I accept the fact that Pope Francis believes this about the Quran, that it doesn't stand for this. I know many Muslims who I have worked with who likewise believe that this is not a true understanding of Islam. But I also know that there are other Muslims out there who believe they have a bona fide reason for thinking that. I just read out of a book, Islamic law, that powerfully seems to indicate that. And I know that there are some Muslims who are some jurisdictions who think that is the law. I also think that even as we look at Egypt today, which is looking to shut down the Muslim Brotherhood for holding such thoughts, less than a year ago, this was the prevailing view even in Egypt. I'm not trying to challenge Pope Francis in his personal views. I'm a big supporter of things going on in places like Egypt. But I also have to keep in mind what's going on in places like Syria, places that's going on in Sudan, Southern Sudan, Nigeria, and Iraq right now. For those who are governed by the likes of Al-Qaeda, this is the law, and those Christians, Muslims, and others are being massacred because of it and killed because that construction can be made and is being imposed. So I think it needs to be said that there is that understanding. So if a close fit can be established between the entities the Vatican and the USCCB interact with and people who put out this book of Islamic law, shouldn't there be some awareness that they might hold to this Islamic doctrine? Let me go back to it. In that book, there is a section of that book, Reliance of the Traveler, that specifically deals with lying. And to the extent that it deals with lying, I would like to just read one part of it. It's Book R, Section 8.2. I will read. This is an explicit statement that lying is sometimes permissible for a given interest. The best analysis of it I have seen is by Imam Abu Hamid Ghazali, who says, speaking is a means of achieving an objective. He then went on to say, what the book, section R then goes on to say, when it is possible to achieve such a name by lying but not by telling the truth, it is permissible to lie if attaining the goal is permissible, and obligatory to lie if the goal is obligatory. Now this becomes important. Now let me say this. This is not to say that all Muslims mislead, and I don't believe that all Muslims believe.
So it must be said that if the canonical text says that it's obligatory to lie when the goal is obligatory, that you can't discount that Muslims who are trying to achieve that goal will use that tactic.
Well, that's especially correct. That was what I was really struggling to say. That we don't have to suspect that every Muslim lies. I don't think that. I just don't have any reason to believe that. But I do think that when we have entities we know are beholden to that text of Islamic law, that to reliance, that they may believe there's that duty. And this becomes important because one of the canons of the interfaith movement is they tell you that dialogue must take place in an atmosphere of mutual trust. Well, I got that, but there's a different parameter on mutual trust that you have to use when you're on notice that some of the people you're dealing with hold themselves to that standard. That's what I was trying to get at. So thank you for helping me with that. So the claim is being made that authentic Islam and a proper reading of the Quran are opposed to every form of violence. And that claim is only buttressed by a generalization that those who oppose it are engaged in hateful generalizations if you disagree. That is a prejudgment that rankles, because that is the hallmark, as it turns out, especially in America, of those who tend to do outreach with groups associated with the Muslim Brotherhood. It just reminds me that about a year ago there was a bishop in Massachusetts who told an ordained deacon that he could not speak to a Catholic men's group at a Catholic forum because it would upset his special relationship with the Islamic society group in which he felt he had a special relationship. In different discussions, Islamic societies, things with the term Islamic society in it, tends to be a flag for a Muslim Brotherhood entity, organization. Then there is the fact that the imam at this one of the original imams at the Islamic Society this bishop was in outreach with in the late 1990s, his name was Salah Sultan. He actually returned to Egypt and went on TV and made some extremely anti-Semitic statements and made some threatening jihadi statements about future in America. So he was not allowed to come back in this country. Right now, he's in jail for his actions in support of the Muslim Brotherhood. That same mosque later, in 2007, the imam, his name was Hafiz Muhammad Hamid, was deported. You had to find out about this by reading Indian and Pakistani newspapers, I will tell you. Why? Because he was affiliated with Lashkar-e-Taiba, a terrorist organization which was known to be associated with the Mumbai attacks. So, I guess the bishop didn't want his deacon, it wasn't his deacon. I guess the bishop didn't want the deacon talking about that. So let's, when we talk about this interfaith stuff, sometimes I ask, do you guys do your due diligence on the people you're working with when you want to shut down fellow believers, fellow Catholics, for wanting to raise issues that are of concern, where they can show a substantive basis to the claims they make? And I truly mean this, I'm Catholic. I mean no disrespect to Pope Francis, nor to the Church. But as a matter of conscience, there is, as Pope Francis said once, a need to shake things up. Because you know what? I'm not a hater for reciting Islamic law from Islamic sources, and those are not generalizations. In fairness, this is not just the Pope and the Vatican or the Catholic Church. This is the interfaith movement writ large, and you'll find that this is going on in all the communities. The Protestant community have the Common Word, and the Jewish community have the Olive Tree Initiative. This issue is about the interfaith movement and how it has been manipulated to serve questionable ends, targeted against those whose critical analytical skills have atrophied. As we discuss interfaith dialogue, we're going to look at some of the rules of the game, suggest that they map to a relativist narrative that the church itself sees as a great modern threat, and raise a question brought up by the famous 12th century philosopher Peter Abelard on the primacy of reason over authority. What did the famous medieval philosopher say? And I'm going to quote him. Authority is inferior to reason because it deals with opinions about the truth rather than with the truth itself, while reason concerns the thing itself and can settle the question. Why am I talking about a medieval philosopher on reason and authority? Because we're living in an era today where there is a complete collapse of reason and a total dependence on authority. The interfaith movement, as we'll see, is based on trusting the authority of the people you're with that they properly represent things. But there's a need to go into the interfaith movement knowing what you know and knowing about the other faiths what reason can tell you you can know. It's at this time I want to finally come back and we're going to start moving on this. This book, it was published by the IIIT. It's called Interfaith Dialogue, A Guide for Muslims. And it was published by the same people who published Reliance of the Traveler, that book of Islamic law I was just reading to you about, having to do with jihad. Okay, the book was put out, was written by a man named Muhammad Shafiq and Muhammad Abu Nimr. And it's about how they want to manipulate the interfaith movement to Muslim Brotherhood ends through enforcing the postmodern rules the interfaith movement set for itself. Do I have a problem with the fact that the various religions get together and talk about the issues that they can talk about and agree on the things they can agree on? Well, who would be against that? I'm pretty much for that. You know, I'm for ecumenicalism. I don't oppose that. But I think there's something called, phony ecumenicalism or phony interfaith movement. And what I have come across looking into the interfaith movement is in Maryland, where I live, and in Northern Virginia, the interfaith movement organization that seems to have notoriety is one that's notoriously found associated with the Industrial Areas Foundation that was founded by Saul Alinsky. And you get to a point where you say, well, what's going on here? And you find out that they're all involved in what I'll call the social justice movement. And let me be very careful, because there's such a thing in theology as social justice. But what I'm really talking about is this wickering of the language, the theological language of social justice, to orient toward state-sponsored, socialist states. And it seems that way. Now, interestingly enough, like I said, the Industrial Areas Foundation was founded by, did I say this already, Saul Alinsky?
The Rules for Radicals guy.
And he wrote Rules for Radicals. And so, you kind of find that you're running into this. Going back to a second, because I want to move into this question and somewhat more deeply, because I think we're living in an era where there's a total collapse of reason. There's a total collapse of reason in our society. And we basically now are turning to a society that makes its decisions based on what people said, not whether it's true, and not even whether it means anything. We are back to having to have the argument that Abelard had in the 12th century. Because I think that the rules of the interfaith movement demand certain inputs that the Muslim Brotherhood has locked on, and they want to use those squishy postmodern rules of the interfaith movement and use them against these people by enforcing them. It's kind of funny, isn't it? They're going to hold them to the rules they created. And there's a book written on this, and of course it was put out by the IIIT, and the name of the book is Interfaith Dialogue. And it came out in, I think, 2007. It came out in a re-release in 2009. So this is a current book. Why is it important? Because the same Islamic entity that's talking about the name of the book, Interfaith Dialogue, and in fact the full name of the book is Interfaith Dialogue, A Guide for Muslims. And the reason this is important is because it's the same entity that certified Reliance of the Traveler as a book of Islamic law. Okay, that says that they're allowed to use misrepresentation. This is important because now we have we are on notice that something might be going on. So what am I talking about when we get to this question? Well, I think that when you read the IIIT book, Interfaith Dialogue, they're basically talking about the rules they seek to have enforced. And here are those rules. Dialogue must take place in an atmosphere of mutual trust. Well, of course you want to have an atmosphere of mutual trust. But there's a difference between mutual trust and blind faith. How about this? Each dialogue partner has the right to define his or her own religion and belief so that the rest can only describe what it looks like to them from the outside. Well, this is kind of disturbing because let's just say you get a book of Islamic law written by Muslim authorities for Muslims and you read it and it says something and you're hearing something that's being said that's totally contrary. According to this rule of mutual trust, you'd be, breaking a major taboo if you interfered with it, but more importantly, you're not allowed to raise that as a question. And finally, there are other rules, but the other rule I'd like to lock onto is here. Practice fairness when speaking for or about other faiths, and then to speak in a way that people of that religion can affirm is accurate. So if you engage in an interfaith movement, you must be trusting. You must base all your discussions about a religion on what that religion says, even if you have competing information that can be shown through due diligence, through reason to be true. And let me just say, in those areas where it's not a question of faith, but a question of published doctrine, you can be shown to be true as a matter of fact. And then again, you can only talk about that religion in the sense in which it's affirming. I think that this IIIT book on interfaith dialogue recognizes that non-Muslim participants are already predisposed to accept the Islamophobia narrative because they already hold themselves to a standard that requires uncritical acceptance of outside narratives at the expense of any factual assessments, prior restraint, or assent before speaking. When you take a look at the interfaith movement and those people, the non-Muslim participants, and you look at those rules where they're supposed to have mutual trust, this all sounds good, except when you realize it can be used to subvert critical thinking, real analysis, and saying and holding up to the truth, because it's very, very narrative enforcing. It denies reasons because it denies due diligence. And it also denies a direct critical examination of Islamic law. And by that I mean reading what their Muslim interfaith partners are publishing and houses that they're publishing from. And just look at what's going out in the world today. We're seeing this. There's something of a reality disorientation going on with this. So not only did the IIIT validate reliance of the traveler, not only did it write the manual on how to do interfaith outreach, but you go all the way back to the 1980s where IIIT wrote a book called The Islamization of a Knowledge, written by a man named Ismail Faruqi, who was one of the founders of the IIIT. And a couple years prior to that, he wrote a book called Christian Ethics, a historical and systematic analysis of its dominant ideas. These people know what they're doing. They know what they seek. They know how they want to convert a group of people who are otherwise maybe critical in other areas of their lives and hit that off switch in the interest of getting along. But at what point does getting along interfere with the truth? And this is the question I'm asking. Okay? But it's not just the Muslim Brotherhood who signed off on this interfaith outreach. If we look at that reliance of the traveler, it's also the OIC. The question I have is the OIC, is the Vatican aware of the OIC lexicon, how it uses terms and what they mean by them? I don't want to go too deep into the OIC today. That's a different subject. But they do have an agenda called the 10-year program of action to convert certain speech laws so that they're very friendly to Islamic legal concepts of the same. It'd also be good, because we're looking at this concept, to look at Said Qutb's book, Islam and Universal Peace. Because if we know that the IIIT is the Muslim Brotherhood, then we also know that they accept Said Qutb as a person, and we take a look at Islam and Universal Peace, his book, and what do we see? We see that the Islamic world, or at least according to the Muslim Brotherhood leader, he's dead now, Sayyid Qutb, he basically says that Islam is the religion of peace. Of course, the religion of peace seeks to establish Islamic law as the law of the land. So when do you have true world peace for Sayyid Qutb? You have world peace when the whole world is brought under. You have world peace when the whole world is ruled, governed by Islamic law. Now, we need to know that lexicon. We need to know that type of language might be in play. Am I saying that Muslims you do interfaith outreach with are always thinking that? No. But we're on notice that some are, and we're on notice that people who hold these ideas are. So we need to take a look at that.
And this, just to get back to the thing that took place at the Vatican for a second.
Yes.
How can you tie in those three passages that Imam read at the Vatican, which he didn't submit in advance? How can you tie that into this greater overall ambition? Like, is this a manifestation of that?
Yes, and if I could just finish one point, I think we're gonna jump right into that. The reason I'm bringing in the OIC, of course, is because the OIC does have a close relationship with the Muslim Brotherhood, going back to the 1980s. And in fact, the OIC met with the Vatican last December, where they agreed to participate in interfaith dialogue, which is the term of art that the Brotherhood is using, which, there's reason to believe they're synced up on this. And I think it's with this understanding that we really need to go take a look. We really need to take a look at what the Imam said. And as we look at it, it's really of extreme importance. The video clip that we saw shows that it was broadcast live to the entire Arab world. So when this Imam got up, he was saying something. And if we read what one of the commentators at the Vatican said, that, this was just a peaceful prayer and some people are getting all worked up, it's not really what was said, we might be missing what may actually have been communicated. Because when the Imam gave those prayers, we heard from a Jesuit priest who's at the Pontifical Gregorian University in Rome. I think his name is Father Kuhner. Okay, we heard from him that the verses perhaps were spontaneously selected by someone who just recited them right off the top of his head. Well, they may have been known from memory, but these are environments where hardly something like this would be said off the top of your head. So I think that as we keep in mind that this was broadcast to the entire Arab world, 90% of which is Muslim, they may well know what he was reading, and they may well know what he said. And so what we're going to do is we're going to take a look at those verses. His prayer started off with 3 verses from the Quran. Surah 2, verses 284, 285, and 286. We're going to take a look at them, and we're going to look at them based on what an authoritative translation of the Quran into English, the Noble Quran, was published by Dar al-Salam out of Saudi Arabia. We're going to take a look at a ready reference tafsir. It's the Tafsir al-Jalalain, and it was put out in the 15th century. But we're also going to look at one of the most authoritative tafsirs put out and translated into English. It's called Tafsir Ibn Kathir. It was put together by a man named Ibn Kathir in the 14th century. And it needs to be pointed out that this is a 10-volume work in its abridged version, and it is considered so authoritative that Sharia books on Sharia law are allowed to reference it as authority. So what we're going to do is we're going to look at 3 Islamic sources that were published from Islamic publishing houses. By the way, Tafsir Ibn Kathir was also it also has the credentials as an authoritative translation. It was also published by Dar al-Salam out of Riyadh. I don't have any reference to the other tafsir, but these are all authoritative publications. Okay, they represent something, and we're going to see what they say. So before we go into these look at these verses from an authoritative perspective, let's take a look what Father Kuhner said, the Jesuit priest at the Pontifical Gregorian University in Rome, because I think he basically minimized this. Remember the Vatican is conceding that these verses, this part of the prayer was not authorized, so it caught them by surprise. Father Kuhner basically argued that this is just a normal, peaceful prayer. He said there are always 3 steps in the 3 religions. We recognize the Creator and praise Him. We recognize our guilt and confess it, and we plead for the gift of peace. And all that comes out very beautifully in these 3 verses of the Quran. To you, God, belongs everything. We repent our guilt and ask for forgiveness. And we need your help so that peace and justice can arise. This all sounds very nice. He goes on and he says, that is the content of these 3 verses. And for that reason, the choice was quite understandable, perhaps spontaneously hit upon, but in any event, well chosen. So Father Kuhner is arguing that this is just perfectly fine and just like anything else. Do you know, he went on and he acknowledged that the recitation might trigger kind of a gag reflex, that the religions did not come together, but he points out that the religions, the 3 groups here, and let's keep this in perspective, the Pope invited the leader of the Palestinian Authority and the president of Israel. So the priest basically says this is just a great translation. Now we need to remember that this was a forum. This was a forum where the Pope invited the president of Israel and the president of the Palestinian Authority to come together to have a prayer of peace. This is the basis of this forum right here. So I'm trying to understand what Father Kuhner is saying when he acknowledged that the recitation of the Quran could trigger certain unease among Christians, but then pointed out that the religions did not come together in the Vatican Gardens to pray together. I thought that's why they came together. He went on and said that each recited their own prayer text in their own way. I mean, I just find this kind of strange. But the most concerning part of what I came across was what he said at the end. And for that reason, there is no misunderstanding here. But if one hears something in a skewed manner, one is going to have a mistaken understanding of it. Yet again, he gives kind of a watered down, kind of a gloss over of what was said in these sayings. And he basically says, if you disagree, you're coming in with a skewed view of it. And more importantly, you'll have a skewed misunderstanding. This implied character attack you always get this implied character attack every time you bring up concerns about Islam when you talk to people who are knee-deep in their interfaith movement. Because part of this interfaith dialogue that we see the Brotherhood doing is to try to get them to try to get their interfaith partners to defend them on our behalf. So that you're going to see that they're going to attack you for even raising the idea. But we're going to look at this. It's never enough just to disagree. There's always this implied character attack. So what do we have? Well, let's take a look at the Noble Quran. This is the Saudi, the authoritative Saudi translation. And really all I want to point out is that in the Saudi translation, in Surah 286, where it says, lay not on us a burden like that which you laid on those before us, it specifically puts in brackets Jews and Christians, so that we understand from this edition of the Quran that it is, in fact, it does in fact relate to Jews and Christians. Now we'll go to the Tasfir by Jalalain. Tasfir. Now this is like a Tasfir in a handbook. It's a brief, ready reference, and so it is not really geared to get you to the authoritative point. It takes parts of it runs through the Quran and it puts the comments to say what it means. And so here we have what it says, and we're going to take a little peek at what it says for Surah 285. Do not differentiate between any of his messengers. The explanation for that is not believing in some and rejecting some, as the Jews and Christians do. So again, in 285, we have an authoritative source that's making a distinction between Jews and Christians and Islam. And finally, in 286, on the line in verse 286 where it says, so help us against the people of the unbelievers, Jalalain explains, It means establish the proof against the unbelievers and enable us to overcome them in fighting. The duty of the master is to help those he protects against their enemies. So this is basically pointing out that the word kufar is used in the Arabic, and it's unbeliever, that they're categorized as being engaged in a fight where they're asking Allah for help against their enemies. Now this is pretty clear. So what we know so far is that these two examples, the Noble Quran and the Tasfir by Al-Jalalain, and I know I'm not doing justice to the pronunciation, or I apologize, are basically saying these have to do with Christians and Jews and how they've not met the mark, and that at least from the Tasfir that there's some hostility. Now we're going to go to Tasfir ibn Kathir. And this is where I think things can get very interesting. In a couple places, we'll read something from Tasfir ibn Kathir, and then where it's appropriate, we'll take a jump over to Reliance of the Traveler, where there's supporting information, just to make it clear that that's true. So, first we'll take a look at Quran verse 284, and we're going to take a look at the section that has to do with 284, where there's an explanation, and it is, we were asked, in explanation of that verse, it says, in the explanation, we were asked to perform what we can bear of deeds, the prayer, the fast, jihad, and charity. However, this ayah was revealed to you, and we cannot bear it. Well, first of all, I'd like to point out that in the explanation it's telling you this has to do with bearing things like jihad, and then it goes on and says that the Messenger of Allah said, Muhammad commented on this, and he said, do you want to repeat what the people of the two scriptures before you said? That is, we hear and we disobey? Rather say, we hear and we obey, and we seek your forgiveness, O Lord, and the return is to you. So again, we are under the understanding that the reference here is a distinction between Muslims and Jews and Christians. Moving on, on another part of 284, we have a reference to 284 where it talks about, our Lord, lay not on us a burden like that which you lay on those before us, and again refers to Jews and Christians. And I just want to point out that, when we take a look at how these verses can be understood, when Muslims who watch us on TV went and get their Tasfir, that they're going to understand how it means. So now we're going to go to verses 285 and 286, Surah 2. Okay? And the first thing I want to do is take a look at a certain part of 285, because there is an examination of it. Each one believes in Allah, His angels, His books, and His messengers. They say, we make no distinction between one another of His messengers. Well, the explanation of that is, the believers also believe in all Allah's prophets and messengers, in the books that were revealed from heaven to the messengers and prophets, who are indeed the servants of Allah. Further, the believers do not differentiate between any of the prophets, such as believing in some of them and rejecting others. So, what of the three religions recognizes all the prophets of Islam, including Muhammad? Well, only Islam. So, Surah 285 applies only to Islam, and it does not apply to Christians and Jews. And it goes on and says this, because this is going to become very important. Rather, all of Allah's prophets and messengers are, to the believers, truthful, righteous, and they were each guided to the path of righteousness, even when some of them bring what abrogates the law of some others by Allah's leave. Later on, the law of Muhammad, the final prophet and the messenger from Allah, abrogated all the laws of the prophets before him. So the last hour will commence while Muhammad's law remains the only valid law, and all the while a group of his ummah will always be on the path of truth. So what we have here is in Surah 285, the explanation of that basically points out that the earlier religions were abrogated. We're going to hit this again. And let's take a look at what Reliance of the Traveler says about that. Remember we read about the objectives of jihad, and it said the Caliph makes war upon Jews and Christians? Well, it goes on and it says, it quotes Quran verse 929, fight those who do not believe in Allah and the last day, and who forbid not what Allah and his messenger have forbidden, and do not practice religion of truth, being those who have been given the book, until they pay the jizya out of hand and are humble. And the explanation here is the time and place for which is before the final descent of Jesus, upon whom be peace. After his final coming, the return of Jesus, nothing but ism will be accepted from them. For the taking of the poll tax is only effective until Jesus' descent, which is the divinely revealed law of Muhammad. The coming of Jesus does not entail a separate divinely revealed law, for he will rule by the law of Muhammad, as the prophets saying, I am the last, there will be no prophet after me. So what does Reliance of the Traveler do? It affirms what was said in the Tafsir here, and it basically says, just like Christians believe, that at the end of days Jesus will return, but unlike what Christians believe, he'll return to cast all Christians to hell for refusing to convert to Islam. So now we get to the most contentious of the three verses, Surah 2, verse 286, and it starts with, Our Lord, lay not on us a burden like that which you did lay on those before us, and it puts in parents, Jews and Christians. And how does it explain this? It explains it by saying, even if we were able to perform them, do not require us to perform the difficult deeds as you required the previous nations before us, such as the burdens that were placed on them. You sent your prophet Muhammad, the prophet of mercy, to abrogate these burdens through the law you revealed to him. So now we have the use of the term abrogation again. And so let's take a quick look at what Reliance of the Traveler said about abrogation of religions. And we're taking a look at section W 4.2. And what does it say? Previously revealed religions were valid in their own eras, as is attested to by the many verses of the Holy Quran, but were abrogated by the universal message of Islam, as is equally attested to by many verses of the Quran. Both points are worthy of attention from English-speaking Muslims who are occasionally exposed to erroneous theories advanced by some teachers and Quran translators, affirming these religions' validity, but denying or not mentioning their abrogation, or that it is unbelief, kufr, to hold that remnant cults now bearing the names of formerly valid religions such as Christianity or Judaism are acceptable to Allah Most High after he sent the final messenger. This is a matter over which there is no disagreement among Islamic scholars. So Reliance of the Traveler is confirming what Tafsir Ibn Kathir said when Tafsir Ibn Kathir says that these religions were abrogated. So let's go back, because we have yet more information here having to do with 386, and of course they're the most contentious. But it's important to point out that 284 and 285 are understood to be in conjunction with Christians and Jews. It relates to the fact that these religions are abrogated. This is part of the prayer the Imam was giving when he was invited onto the Vatican grounds to the Pope in the presence of an Israeli who is Jewish. What does this final, most contentious part of 286 say? And give us victory over the disbelieving people. Well, Tafsir Ibn Kathir explains this way. Those who rejected your religion, denied your oneness, refused the message of your prophet, the Prophet Muhammad, worshipped other than you, and associate others in your worship. Give us victory and make us prevail above them in this and in the hereafter. So this is clearly a discussion about victory over Christians and Jews. Would you agree?
Well, from everything you're saying, it sounds like the exact antithesis of something you would read in the interest of peace and harmony and mutual cooperation. That's for sure. It sounds like it's exact antithesis.
Well, absolutely. I mean, you cannot when we heard Father Kuhner basically say that this was all sparkles and light, and completely discast this understanding of what the Imam could have said, which was broadcast to the entire Arab world, where this looks to be the more closer interpretation that I would be accused of being skewed in my analysis of. There's one more point let me point out about what was said here. When we look at that 286 explanation and give victory over the disbelieving people, let me reread part of it, because I want to point something out. It means those who rejected your religion, denied your oneness, refused the message of the prophet. Okay, but it goes on and it says, and I'm repeating myself, but this is important: worship other than you and associate others in your worship. That's a reference to Christians. How do we know that? Because if we go to back to the Noble Quran, we can go read 3 verses in almost rapid succession that totally disavow Christianity. But the one that's most important is Surah 5, verse 73. Surely disbelievers are those who said Allah is third of 3 in a trinity. But there is no Ilah, none who has the right to be worshipped but one Ilah. And if they cease not from what they say, verily a painful torment will befall on the disbelievers among them. So this is actually kind of an attack on Christians. Now, I'd like to point out that just as I could go get Tafsir Ibn Kathir, I think it's not beyond the range of saying that anybody who goes to a mosque in the Arabic world could go get Tafsir Ibn Kathir, read up that verse, and read up what it says. So I think we're looking at something that may pass for a genuine interpretation. But there's another issue here, and that's the issue of how the Imam went on with his free-form prayer afterwards. Okay? And I'm not going to focus on all of it, but I would like to focus on the part where he said, make victorious those whose blood has been spilled, and those bereaved, and those who have been displaced and threatened upon your earth, O Lord of worlds. Have mercy on humanity through your grace until a just and complete peace. Well, this is kind of, I'm going to take a look at this that raises a question about what this could have meant, because, of course, we're talking about the Palestinian Authority, which does not recognize Israel's right. They do not recognize the state of Israel. They do not recognize Israel's right to exist. And so the blood that has been spilled would be the blood of the martyrs, or the shaheed in Islam, and they're bereaved. And those who are displaced and threatened would be, of course, the Palestinians, because for them they have been pushed out of their territory. And a just and complete peace would raise the question of a just and complete peace to an imam would, of course, wouldn't that have to be a just and complete peace according to Islam? Well, and yes, and I want to raise something, because if it is a just and complete peace, okay, let's take a look. Remember, I introduced to you earlier Said Qutb's book on universal peace, and I think it's appropriate right now to talk about what that might mean. Reading from Said Qutb's book, Universal Islam and Universal Peace, we have this. Then what is the word of God that justifies war according to Islam? The word of God is the expression of his will as specified in the Quranic verse, and fight them until there is no more tumult and oppression. And it's quoting Surah 8:39. That's a Quran verse, by the way. But it goes on. The divine law must dominate all secular and religious systems. Whoever usurps the rights to legislate laws on his own is claiming a share in the divine powers of organizing the universal system. Such a person would be claiming, implicitly if not explicitly, a share in God's attributes. In other words, he would be taking on himself the right to rule as another God on earth. And finally, in order to propagate the oneness of God on earth and to put an end to the power of those who, by word or deed, challenge his omnipotence, Islam allows Muslims to fight. such as the only war allowed in Islam. So the fight for peace and justice would be the jihad to bring Islam to the world and then have peace. But because we're talking about this tumult and oppression, and because the Palestinians believe that they want the occupied territory back, we need to keep in mind that he read verses from Surah 2. And earlier in Surah 2, if Surah 2 verse 284, 85, and 86 end Surah 2, you could say they reached their high point in verses 191, 192, and 193. And it seems it's possible to argue, and I've heard people make this argument, the listener can make their own judgment, that maybe he's speaking to these verses. Okay? First, the support for this argument it makes sense. He seems to be alluding to it when he's associating the Palestinians with what was going on in those verses. And second, the Palestinians, as noted, do not recognize a Palestinian state. So let's take a look at those verses. Surah 2, verse 191, 92, and 93 from the Noble Quran. And kill them wherever you find them, and turn them out from where they have turned you out. And fitna is worse than killing. And fight not with them at the Al-Masjid al-Haram, unless they first fight you there. But if they attack you, then kill them. Such is the recompense of the disbelievers. Well, this is not about fighting at the mosque, but it is stating that fitna is worse than killing. 192. And if they cease, then Allah is oft forgiving and most merciful. Fitna is polytheism. I'm going to read it right here because there's a footnote to it. Al-fitna, polytheism, to disbelieve other than, Al-fitna, polytheism, to disbelieve after one has believed in Allah, or a trial or calamity or an affliction. Now, for the Palestinians, they would argue that there's fitna in the land because they don't recognize the Israeli state, and so they believe there's what would be called tumult and oppression in the land, or fitna. And of course, the point here is fitna is worse than killing. 193. And fight until there is no more fitna, disbelief and worshipping of others along with Allah, and all and every kind of worship is for Allah alone. But if they cease, let there be no transgression except against al-zalimum, that is the polytheists and the wrongdoers. So it's very important that when we look at verse 193, that there's a footnote, and it's a footnote to a hadith. And the hadith says, this is Muhammad, I have been ordered to fight against the people until they testify that there is no God but God. Muhammad is the messenger of God. And it goes on and says, and pay the salat and something. So that this is basically a jihad saying. So what does Tafsir Ibn Kathir say about these verses? And I don't want to spend too much time on it because we're being speculative. But what it really basically says is shirk is worse than killing. Since jihad involves killing and shedding the blood of men, Allah indicated these men are committing disbelief in Allah, associating with Him in the worship, and hindering from His path. And this is much greater evil and more disastrous than killing. The crime of shirk is to elevate to authority an authority that equals the authority of Allah. And if you're engaging in fitna, you become guilty of shirk because it's a sense in which you're denying the authority of God. That would be my quick answer there. When I was reading that verse, it basically said, and fitna is worse than killing, meaning that you disbelievers are committing what you disbelievers are committing is much worse than killing. So there's a whole lot of other ones here, but I think at this point what we need to do is just point out that the free-form statements of the Imam can easily be looked at as heading this direction. It works this way. I have been told that's what the reference was to, but I don't know. But I just wanted to hit this to check off this point and raise the point that in the interest of saying that everything's light and pleasantry, I don't think it's, that may be the skewed response. This analysis was not based on generalizations. It's not skewed. The Imam walked right into the Vatican grounds and dissed the Pope to his face with these words, ignoring the rules of the forum. He knew he was violating them. He knew what he was saying. Israel, Shimon Peres was the invited guest of the Vatican at the same forum. A powerful argument that can be made that he dissed him as well. I was told by more than a few people in researching this question that they've heard these verses read more than once at interfaith forums and that we shouldn't be concerned. Well, if that's true that these are read at interfaith forums and you see a whole bunch of interfaith people going, you know, that's a concern. Because I think that we can lay down here that if we can show that an authoritative translation of the Quran suggests this has to do with Christians and Jews, and if we're reading Tasfiris, who says it takes a hostile bent to it, and basically points them out as kuffar, the object of hostility, then this is something that needs to be accounted for and needs to be understood. At least in the American iteration, the Muslim Brotherhood has identified the interfaith crowd as people who are very squishy and very captured by a postmodern narrative that does not acknowledge truth. There are no facts, there is no truth. And so they're willing to have a completely open and trusting mind of what the other is saying, the other religion is saying, and the rules of the interfaith movement compel them to accept that understanding of Islam in violation of all tenets of reason and in violation of all tenets of due diligence. So I find that the statements of the Imam to be questionable, disturbing. Not least of which is the response that seemed to posit that there was nothing here to see. And the problem is, I think that may be how the rest of the Western world will look at that. While at the same time, the Arab world, which watched it live on TV, who we should think if they're attuned to Islam, understood what this means or could have meant, even among those Muslims who don't agree with what that means. They may very well mean they might not agree with that construction, all the while understanding that that is what that Imam meant. And so I think that we need to be honest with these discussions of interfaith movement. We need to stop treating people who raise these questions as if they're defective or hateful or skewed in their views, because I think that we put together something here that can stand scrutiny. I mean, I'm willing to have people come back and challenge this, because if it's wrong, it's wrong. But I put up a case that's credible,